Well, hello and welcome to this New Zealand Initiative webinar. My name is Oliver Hartwich, and it's my great pleasure to welcome you to the launch of our newest report. It's called MMP After 30 Years. It is a report dealing with the experiences we've made with our electoral system, mixed member proportional. And it is a report not asking whether we should now return to first past the post, but really asking the question, is it time to make it work better? Because in previous elections, we have seen quite a few oddities about the operations of MMP in New Zealand, and we thought it would be a really good idea and a good contribution to our political debates to go into these quirks of MMP as it is being practiced in New Zealand and ask ourselves whether we could do things to improve it. To do this, I'm very happy to see my colleague Nick Clark on the webinar, who is the author of the report. Hi, Nick. And also the author of the foreword of the report, David Farrar. Neither of you need much of an introduction. Nick, of course, is known to all of the initiative community as the author of many papers, mainly dealing with local government and infrastructure. And David, of course, doesn't need much of an introduction either as New Zealand's leading pollster and politics enthusiast. I think I know very few people who live and breathe politics as much as David does. So it's a great pleasure to have you on this webinar. And it was an honor to have you as the author of the foreword. For those of you who've been on our webinars before, you know exactly how they work. We'll, of course, hear from the author of the report. Nick will speak for about 10 minutes. Then we'll get David's comments. And afterwards, it's time for Q&A. And as always, you can ask your questions via slido.com. It's easy. You go to slido.com, you put in the code, which is 1861878. I'll also share that with you in the webinar chat, and then I will tend to ask the most popular questions to both Nick and David. But for now, over to you, Nick. Congratulations on your report. Tell us what it's all about.
Thank you, Oliver, and hi everyone, and great to have a good number of people on the webinar. Over the next 10 minutes, I'll be presenting our latest research, or my latest research, and this has been on electoral reform in New Zealand. The report examines the issues and policy options for improving our MMP system after nearly 30 years of operation and 10 elections in the belt. Right, to start with, let's start with the fundamental point, which probably seems a bit obvious, but I'll say it anyway. Electoral systems are the foundation for our democracy. They're not just administrative details, they shape everything about our political landscape. Specifically, electoral systems determine how votes translate into seats. They create incentives that drive political parties' behaviour. They affect the quality of the representation we get, and ultimately they influence the level of trust New Zealanders have in Parliament itself. Look, it's important to acknowledge that I think MMPs actually worked mostly as it was intended when it was introduced. Parties' MPs generally reflect the share of the vote. We've maintained geographical representation through the electorate seats. Governments have mostly been stable and have gone to full term. But as always with any system, there's room for improvement. And as Oliver mentioned, the 2023 election highlighted some specific problems with our system. There were 3 overhang seats that affect proportionality. Overhangs are caused when a party wins more electorates than it's entitled to based on its overall share of the nationwide party vote. So there were 3 at this time around. Normally we have 120 MPs. This time around we've got 123. There was a quirk with the electoral rules which led to a by-election in Port Waikato only weeks after the election. And at the election, the people in Port Waikato could only vote for the party. They couldn't vote for the candidate. So they had to wait for their candidate vote for several weeks. We had a 3-week delay in final results being declared, which resulted in a bit of uncertainty, quite a bit of uncertainty as to the exact number of seats for each party, and therefore delayed the coalition negotiations starting in earnest, so adding to the delay in forming a government. And we also have some outdated restrictions around election day that no longer make sense given our advanced voting system. But beyond these immediate issues that sort of directly reflect what happened in 2023, There are some bigger structural issues that we also should address, in my view. So those include the term of Parliament, the length of it, the size of Parliament and the split between list and electorate MPs, the 5% party vote threshold, what we call coattailing provisions, and I'll get onto these definitions later, waka-jumping legislation, and the role of Māori seats. So our report is structured into several key sections. David, on the screen, he's provided a lively and compelling foreword befitting his great experience and knowledge and enthusiasm on electoral matters. And I'd really commend people to read that foreword. It's a good read. After the executive summary and introduction, we explain how MMP works in New Zealand and then sort of dive into the constitutional issues, MMP design issues, and voting issues. We also provide some international comparisons before presenting our reform recommendations and conclusions. But today, for this webinar, I'll focus on the three main areas highlighted in bold, which are the constitutional issues, the MMP design issues, and the voting issues. And these represent the core of the report's analysis and recommendations. So on constitutional issues, I examined the seven sort of key areas just shown on the slide. That's the parliamentary term, the question of a second chamber, election timing, the size of Parliament, the size of the executive, the role of referendums, and Māori electorates. On MMP design issues, I looked at overhang seats and their impact on proportionality, the 1-seat threshold, also known as coattailing, the 5% party vote threshold and wasted votes, and the split between electorate MPs and list MPs, by-elections and waka-jumping, as mentioned. And on voting issues, it was special vote processing, election day restrictions, public understanding and media coverage, and compulsory voting. It's important to be clear also about what we're not covering in this report. We're not proposing to replace MMP by another or with another electoral system entirely. This was relitigated in 2011 by referendum, and at that time MMP was confirmed by an increased margin, about 58 to 42 if I remember rightly, compared to 1993's referendum, which was 54% to 46%. We're also not addressing voter eligibility issues, rules for political parties in campaigning or financing, or technology issues, and nor do we discuss local government elections. Look, these are important issues, but they're outside the scope of the report. The report would probably have been about twice as long as it is now, but they could be considered in future research. Right, so apologies for the table and the dense words on here, but just want to run very quickly through the key findings on constitutional issues. We find that 3 years is very short for a parliamentary term by international standards. A second chamber could help with scrutiny, but it isn't a necessary condition for extending the term based on international experience. We have flexibility on election timing, quite considerable flexibility, although in practice they're usually held between September and November of the third year of the term. At 120 MPs, our parliament is small internationally. Electorates have over time become very large, both geographically and in population compared to when MMP came in, let alone before MMP. This makes them much harder to service and to represent. Meanwhile, our executive of 30 ministers and undersecretaries is very large, around a quarter of all MPs and nearly half of government MPs. And with that, there's also many bizarre number of portfolios serviced by a large number of departments. And this, coupled with our relatively small number of what I'd call ordinary MPs, makes effective scrutiny by overburdened select committees much harder. Government-initiated referendums, they've been used for a variety of issues and relatively effectively, but citizens-initiated referendums have been, frankly, ineffectual. And as for the Māori electorates, they're historically important, but they're no longer necessary to guarantee strong Māori representation and they do create overhangs. I think in the report we say that 27% of MPs have Maori identification, whereas they're 19% of the population. But that said, they would be very, very difficult to abolish. So the recommendations in this section in the blue would be to increase the parliamentary term to 4 years, coupled with stronger scrutiny from select committees. The second chamber, consider it on its own merits, but it shouldn't be a precondition for having a longer term. Third, set a 2-month window for elections with flexibility within it. That's what they do in Germany, basically. Fourth, increase parliament size to 170 MPs following what's called the cube root law, which is an empirical observation of parliamentary size, which tries to balance off transaction costs with representation benefits. 170 would be consistent with several European countries with similar populations to New Zealand. That includes ranging from Norway, which has 169 MPs, Ireland, Denmark, and then up to Finland with 200 MPs. All of them have around the same population of New Zealand. Many will no doubt bristle at the very idea of more politicians and the cost of more MPs. Fair enough. But that extra cost would not be large compared to the size of many of our government departments. The extra cost could be offset by the fifth recommendation, which is to reduce the executive to 15 ministers and maybe 10 junior ministers while consolidating portfolios and departments. That will help Parliament do a more effective job at keeping track of the executive and government departments. Sixth, retain government-initiated referendums for significant constitutional and conscience issues, but either abolish or significantly strengthen citizens-initiated referendums to make them worth their while. And finally, as mentioned, proposing to keep the Maori electorates, but address the issues around overhangs and proportionality they can create. On the MMP design issues, our findings are that overhang seats affect proportionality and they can influence party strategies in problematic ways. Certainly they have the potential to. The 1-seat threshold reduces wasted votes, but it also influences party strategies. And the Epsom deal is an example of that, albeit I'm not sure how effective those deals have been in practice. The 5% threshold reduces fragmentation, but results in many wasted votes and creates a high barrier for new parties, which might actually be useful alternatives for the larger parties to have more options to choose from. Our current 60-40 split has become imbalanced over time and increases the risks of overhangs. The Port Waikato situation exposed quirks in by-election laws and rules, and more generally, I believe by-elections are costly with low turnouts and decreasing turnouts, and they can, if they happen midterm and the seat changes hands, lead to a loss of proportionality. And finally, while waka-jumping legislation, which basically is an impediment to MPs changing parties or resigning from their party and staying in the House, that provides stability and protects proportionality, but it unduly restricts MPs' freedom of expression and conscience. So recommendations here, we're suggesting to abolish overhang seats and implement our other recommendations to make this workable. When I say abolish, I don't mean electorates being unfilled like in Germany. That would not be acceptable to people in those electorates. My proposal is to no longer make the ad hoc additions of list MPs as we do currently. The adding of a few list seats is fine if the overhang is one-off for a tiny party, like maybe United Future in 2014, or an independent MP, if we ever had one of those again, but it does not work so well when there are multiple seats involved. Abolishing overhangs would work for proportionality if we changed to a 50-50 split between electorate and list MPs as originally recommended by the 1986 Royal Commission. This is because you'd have a larger number of top-up list MPs to make up the numbers and dilute that overhang. It would also work for representation if we increase Parliament size to protect the current number of electorates to 170. We don't want electorates getting fewer and even larger, which is what would happen if we went to a 50-50 split on a 120-seat Parliament. We want to retain the one-seat threshold as it reduces wasted votes and helps with proportionality. We want to reduce the party vote threshold to either 4% or 3.5% to also reduce wasted votes and help with proportionality. We want to fix the quirk where a candidate dying during the campaign creates an extra could create an extra overhang seat. More broadly, we suggest to abolish by-elections entirely with vacancies filled from the party's list. And finally, we suggest repealing the waka-jumping legislation to protect MPs' freedom of conscience. On the voting issues, the final set of issues, we've had huge growth in special votes. That's created pressure on timely processing, leading to long delays, as mentioned, delays in commencing coalition negotiations. Election day restrictions have become inconsistent and outdated, especially now that most people, 68% in 2020 and 61% in 2023, now vote during the advance period. That's the 12 days leading up to polling day. New Zealanders continue to have weak understanding of our democracy and MMP's operation. And while voter turnout has slipped since the 1980s, it remains relatively strong at between 75 and 80%. Compulsory voting could increase participation, but not necessarily its quality, and not voting is, as I'm reminded, a quite legitimate choice in itself. So recommendations here, we recommend several changes in terms of the special votes, close the electoral rolls prior to advance voting and have a shorter set period for advance voting, make it short and sharp. Allow special votes to be processed and verified during the voting period rather than not starting until after the polls close. And both of these measures are included actually in a bill that's currently before Parliament. Launch a strong campaign to get people enrolled with updated details before the rolls close and allow people turning 18 during the voting period to pre-enroll. And the latter is also part of the bill before Parliament. Make any restrictions on campaigning and advertising consistent across the entire voting period, not just election day. Improve civics knowledge and create incentives for it. Encourage media to focus more on the party vote and less on individual electorate contests, as hard as that might be to do in practice. And finally, retain voluntary voting rather than make it compulsory. So now, in my view, these changes are designed to enhance the fairness and efficiency of the electoral system. They should reduce the risks of overhangs and gaming the system and reduce wasted votes and improve proportionality. They would improve local representation and MPs' workloads while protecting their freedom of speech and conscience. They would improve parliamentary scrutiny while reducing the executive's dominance over caucuses and Parliament. They would also improve the timeliness of election results and government formation and provide consistent rules while hopefully improving public understanding. And thank you very much. That's all from me, and I look forward to discussion and questions after David has had his say.
Thank you very much, Nick. And once again, congratulations on the report. As we would have all seen, these are complicated matters. So if you want to find out more, you can download the report from our website at nzinitiative.org.nz. But for now, thank you, Nick. And now we look forward to hearing from you, David.
Okay, thank you. I thought I would start with the issue on which technically I have a conflict of interest, but I argue against it, which is the term of Parliament. As a pollster, I should want a shorter term of Parliament. Elections every 12 months would be wonderful as a pollster, but actually I'm a very firm advocate of the proposal to go from 3 to 4 years for two reasons. The first is, look, I've spent 25 years in and around Parliament. And again, as a pollster, let me tell you, a number of times you hear, oh, we can't do that, it's too close to the election. So many New Zealanders say, oh, the problem with New Zealand is we don't focus enough on the long term. Here's the simple solution. Change the term from 3 years to longer. You'll get governments focusing more on the long term. Now, the biggest argument I hear from people against it, and it's often when they don't like the government in power, is, oh, no, it's too long to get rid of a bad government. It makes the government unaccountable if there's a long gap between elections. But here's the thing, it's been 50 years since we had a one-term government. We've had lots of bad governments in that time. We don't get rid of bad governments because instinctively we tend to think they need more time. I actually think if you have a longer term, you will actually end up with more one-term governments, which would be a good thing. I actually had a look back through the polling data back to the 70s to try and see who might have lost after one term if it had been a 4-year term. And interestingly, the two that come up are the Labour government in 87 to 90. They got re-elected easily in 87, but a year later, after the share market crashed, they started to infight. They may have struggled for a second term. And arguably, the Ardern government in 2021 massively, 12 months later in 2021, could have been quite different. Now, that's not the reason to support going from 3 to 4 years, but we in Australia are almost the only countries in the world that have the 3-year term. And a former chief of staff to Prime Minister once said to me that is the one thing that could improve public policy and long-term focus in New Zealand, because your first year is basically your manifesto. Your final year is getting ready for the election. So it would double effectively your good government time. Now, going to the other big one, which is the size of Parliament, and let's not fool ourselves that this is not going to happen or be popular, but I think it's worth making the point that our electorates are too large. We actually want MPs to be in touch with people. We do have a very small Parliament for our size. As you heard from Nick, I think Ireland has 234 MPs. Australia actually has 847 MPs because, of course, they have upper houses and state parliaments. And in the United States, they've got 7,921. The other great benefit I see from a bigger parliament is it gives you a bigger talent pool for cabinet, because actually a cabinet or executive of 30 out of a parliament of 120 is a big proportion. And it also allows the executive to dominate the government caucuses. If you've got 28 ministers, a speaker, a deputy speaker, and the whips, it's actually very hard for backbenchers to have much influence. Unlike in the UK, where actually the whips have a lot harder job having to convince their backbenchers, that they should vote with the government. Going then into, because I think the questions are going to be the highlight, but some of the aspects of MMP that Nick's touched on, I find myself having changed my mind on the 5% threshold over the years. I used to be against lowering it, partly because no one wants to be like Israel, where you have around 12 parties in parliament and you can't form government. But also I look at the history where if we had lowered it, Graham Capwell may have come in 1996, held the balance of power, and he wasn't a particularly pleasant person, to put it mildly. And the other person who came close was Colin Craig, who was a fairly controversial figure too. But I think there's nothing more important in the Trump world at the moment than protecting trust in institutions. And there are 3 to 4% of the population out there who, their politics aren't mine, want a religious Christian party in parliament, and they keep missing out with the 5% threshold. And actually, we would be better for them to be able to have that party. You've got people who got very worried about the vaccine, and they've put parties in. And now it's easy to stand back and say, well, no, they're all the fringe. But actually, you want trust in the institution. So having a slightly lower threshold, I actually think will help build trust. And it's worth noting that we've actually now got a 3-party coalition government. The world hasn't ended. It's actually probably working better than some 2-party coalition governments. So I think that's a good one to do. The coattailing, the people on the left have tended to be very against coattailing because they see this benefits the ACT Party. But what people don't realise is it last benefited the ACT Party in 2008. Yes, that long ago, 5 or 6 elections ago, is the last time ACT got a list MP in through coattailing. The last party to benefit from it was actually the Maori Party in 2014, where they got a list MP. So I actually do think keeping coattailing is good, not because it might help at Tōti Pāhi Māori, but actually it makes Parliament more proportional. The whole benefit of MMP is how people vote should effectively determine the Parliament, that the parties that form the government have more votes than the parties in the opposition. And I think lowering the threshold helps with that. But so does Nick's recommendation to effectively get rid of overhang, because it hasn't yet happened. But I think in the next election, there's a very real possibility that overhang could lead to parties with fewer votes forming the government over parties with more votes. You could have the National Party actually get a 5 or 6 seat overhang, and I imagine people on the left would be very upset if National held on to power, even though they got fewer votes due to overhang. But likewise, Te Pāhi Māori, if they don't split into several parties, could have a 4-seat overhang, which again could actually deliver government there. So if you think MMP is about the government having the moral mandate of the most votes, I think Nick's recommendations are very useful to that. I think probably that's enough from me. I see there's lots of questions there, so I'll look forward to Oliver throwing some our way.
Great. Thank you, David. And once again, thank you, Nick. As you said, we've had time for questions. So let's take the first one. And the most popular one comes from Graham Edgeler. Are there examples of countries or even states that have increased the term length of their legislatures that have seen improvements in government? Nick, maybe.
Yeah, sure. I'll have a go at that one. Look, the vast majority of countries already have 4 or 5 year terms. So there aren't that many that have shorter terms. I think there's only about half a dozen that have a 3-year term. So in a lot of those 4 to 5 year term countries have had those terms for a long, long time. I'm not trying to dodge the question, but as far as I'm aware, there is in more recent times, most of the Australian states have gone from 3 years to 4-year terms, although the Australian federal government still has a 3-year term. The countries that are left with 3-year terms, apart from us in Australia, just having a look, El Salvador, Mexico, Nauru, the Philippines, and Tonga. I'm not 100% sure the strength of their governance compared to, say, some of those European countries, the OECD countries that we like to compare ourselves with that have 4 or 5 year terms.
I'll just add to that, and I'll reply to Graham in the style he enjoys, being edgelord. In 1716, the UK extended the term of Parliament from 3 years to 7 years, and I'm sure we all would agree that the UK was better governed after 1716 than before 1716. But what Nick said, 3 years is very rare and it is just too short. I think you would be hard pushed to make the case for 4 to 5 or 5 to 6. So it isn't about so much increasing it, it's just that 3 is too short.
Good point, thank you. Next question then. Do you support governments being able to appoint non-MPs to the executive? Seems like no democratic reason why not to, given we have list MPs under MMP. Thoughts?
Look, I can see the appeal if you can get some genuinely top-ranked people in those roles, but I just think it'd be it's completely unprecedented for New Zealand to have appointed cabinet members, and also there's a very weak, if not any, relationship back to the electorate. Whereas at least with party lists, list MPs, you've got party lists that people vote on.
It does happen in the UK. I mean, that's how David Cameron came back as Foreign Secretary.
Yep, he was in the Lords, wasn't he?
Yes, exactly.
I'm not saying that's necessarily a great precedent.
Well, okay. I won't say much about David Cameron here anyway. Is there a concern that MMP gives minor parties outsized influence at the expense of national labour? They play kingmaker, their agendas dominates. Is it a tail wagging the dog?
It all depends on the relative strengths of the parties involved. So, and how big the majority is. the parties. So I mean, it could well be that at times when National or Labour have been very strong, when they've had the lion's share of the seats in any government, they will get their way a lot more, and fair enough, because they've got the vast majority of the seats. I'm thinking the John Key era, for example. But when parties are more, you know, when those minor parties are stronger, they count for more, and that's probably understandable too.
And on the same issue, Jordan Williams asks also about the tail wagging the dog. How does your reduced threshold recommendation not make that dog tail wagging worse?
Look, I think David handled that pretty well in his comments on the report. I think in New Zealand, we don't quite have the degree, we wouldn't have the degree of fragmentation you get in some countries, particularly like the Netherlands, where I think their threshold is less than 1%, and therefore you get a lot of MPs and a lot of parties in that parliament. We're suggesting a relatively modest reduction. It's still at 3.5%, it's still at 100,000 votes. At 3.5%, it's about 114,000 votes based on 2023. Those are still some pretty reasonably tough hurdles to meet. We also have a bit of our political culture isn't quite like that either. I mean, there's still the major parties, notwithstanding a little bit of an erosion in their combined support, still attract, generally speaking, I mean, last election was a bit lower at 65%, but generally 75 to 80% of the votes cast are usually for the two major parties anyway.
Next question then, why a 4-year term and not a 5-year term? And I mean, on that, we know that the UK has a 5-year term. I think 15 out of 16 German federal states have now gone to 5 years as well. So there is a movement around the world towards even longer terms.
I mean, well, sure. I mean, you could look at having a longer term. I think there's also politics is the art of the possible, and maybe jumping from 3 to 5 years might be harder to convince people of the merits of compared to jumping from 3 to 4. I'd be interested in David's view on that, actually.
I think the danger with getting too long is the arrogance that can set in, that governments can feel invulnerable because the election is so far away, they just don't have to worry about consequences. I think 4 is a fairly happy medium there. But as Nick says, you know, if you move from 3 to 4, you could then have a debate in the future about 4 versus 5. I don't think we've ever seen any country go from 4 to 3.
Do you have any thoughts on removing the electorate seats altogether? I mean, this would no longer be MMP, this would be a purely proportional system. But of course, it would prevent parties from having more seats than the share of the party vote.
Yeah, I mean, one of the reasons why MMP was chosen by the Royal Commission as being its preferred option was that it was considered important to retain a geographical representation. If you went to fully PR system, proportional representation system, there's no guarantee that you would get any MPs from certain geographical areas. So, and given that New Zealand came from a culture of having very localised, you know, just fully electorates, you know, I just don't think that would be a wise approach, particularly for a country as diverse and as spread out as New Zealand. It would be hopeless to have all your MPs coming from, I don't know, Christchurch, for example, and none from anywhere else. I use Christchurch as my hometown.
Add to that, in polling, if you ask people what you think of MPs as a group, they rank them, I think, between prostitutes and used car salespeople. But if you ask what you think of your local electorate MP, they say they're great. We like them. They're in the community. They do stuff. I think it's really vital you have electorate MPs because I think it takes politics from the abstract into the community. I think it's good for communities to have an electorate MP whose job is there to advocate for them. It's not just about passing laws in Parliament. And as I say, most people actually know their local MP, have a good impression of them. If you remove that, then I think trust in Parliament and institutions gets weakened.
Fair point. Next question is from Michelle Borg. The abolition of by-elections. how does taking the next person on the list provide local representation for constituents of the affected electorate? Nick.
Yeah, so it's a good question. My expectation would be that political parties would it would be in their interests to have someone that's reasonably close to the electorate concerned, at least make them have a connection with it. That said, most by-elections happen with not a lot of time necessarily left in the parliamentary term, so it might not be absolutely essential for what is effectively a placeholder position to dictate that the person has to be residing in that electorate. In fact, there are probably quite a few electorate MPs that aren't necessarily residing in their electorates even now. Oliver, this was something that was from Germany experience. How does it work in Germany? Because I think they use party list replacements there too.
Well, I believe they come from the list, but I think the local party association has a say in that too. I mean, it depends on how you want to design the system. You could actually leave it to the local party association to nominate who will replace the vacant seat.
Yeah.
I mean, there are ways in which you could probably ensure that there will be local representation. Anyway, since you mentioned Germany, the next question actually on the list is about Germany, but I think it's a bit of a misunderstanding. Should we adopt the German system whereby the party with the most votes forms the government? Because this would prevent a scenario like 2017, where National, of course, won more votes than Labour, but Jacinda Ardern became prime minister. The misunderstanding here, and I think I can probably speak to it as the German in the room, this is not quite correct, actually. Germany had cases where the party with the most votes did not form the government. This has happened at state level several times, and most famously at the national level, the federal level, in 1976, when Helmut Kohl won, I believe, 48 point something % of the vote, but the Social Democrats formed a coalition with the Liberals and still governed, even though the CDU-CSU had the most votes. So I don't think there is a constitutional rule, but in any case, I mean, any thoughts from either of you on whether there should be a rule that the party with the most votes should always be tasked first with forming a government?
I'll throw that one to you, David.
Well, going first doesn't mean a lot. In the end, you have to get 61 seats in the House to govern. So, yeah, that is what determines who gets to form government. What I think you'd be better to look at is whether there should be almost a cultural expectation that small parties should allow the biggest party a fair go at forming government, even if they disagree with them. And you have that in Canada, where often you have minority government in Canada, and they get to become government even with unusual support. For example, you've had the Conservative Party supported on competence and supply by the NDP, who are to the left of the Liberal Party. In Canada, that's a very strong cultural convention. So I think to not give that biggest party a fair go, you would get punished for it. But even that's starting to break down. At the end, it is only a cultural convention. If you look at New Zealand, we just don't have that cultural convention. You could argue we had it before 2017, but now we've had a government where the largest party didn't get to form power. I don't think there would be any support for trying to codify it.
Yeah, I agree with that.
Next question then. If Parliament grew to 170 MPs, would you expect the quality of ministers and legislation to noticeably improve?
Yeah, I'd like to think so. Just especially if we also, reduce the size of the executive. The idea behind 170 MPs is not only to, address issues with workload of MPs, which particularly for electorate MPs that have huge burden given the size of the electorates they have to maintain, and therefore their ability to, to do the scrutiny and the policy work, etc., that would be expected of them as well. But it would also mean that it'll mean select committees could be stronger. You wouldn't have people flitting about from select committee to select committee because they have to cover 3 or 4 because they come from a small party. You'd be able to develop more specialist knowledge and experience on select committees. I think I'm hopeful that you would. I mean, there's obviously, you can't completely guarantee an outcome, but I would expect that having stronger scrutiny would improve the quality of legislation and policy.
And look, I look at how many MPs the major parties especially can bring in on the list, and National, because they won so many seats, can only bring 5 in at the moment. There's so many talented people I know who would be great ministers who are lower down that list, who a larger parliament would allow you to bring more in. So I'm very convinced it would be higher quality ministers. Higher quality legislation's a more indirect one, but what Nick said, that MPs at the moment are literally running from select committee to select committee, doesn't give them a lot of time to read the papers in advance, and Jordan's 200,000 submissions that he's arranged on a bill, etc. So I think there would be indirect benefit there.
And we had a case like that in the last election where National had already kind of chosen James Christmas as potentially the next Attorney General, and he narrowly missed out because he didn't make it into Parliament. So for people like that, actually, with a professional career, it just becomes unattractive to even have a go at it because you don't know whether the party will even get any list MPs. And so you invest all of this into that possibility only to find out you're missing out.
Yeah, I've had talks with a few potential National MPs looking to stand. 1 or 2 of them would be absolute stars, and my advice has been forget it this time unless there's a safe electorate. You've got almost no chance to come in as a list MP.
Yep. Question from Tim Clark. What do you say to the argument that MMP has not fully matured in New Zealand yet? For example, the prospect of a grand coalition, or as I would say it, New Zealand still speaks MMP with an FPP accent.
Yeah, that's an interesting question. We've had 30 years, and all systems evolve and mature over time, no doubt about that. I mean, it would be very interesting to see if we ever do get a grand coalition. It seems pretty unlikely at the moment, but you never know if parties on the extreme, when I say extreme, on the either on the right or the left of the 2 main parties get particularly strong, then there might be an impetus for that. But I can't see that quite happening in the short term.
The problem with grand coalitions is they actually help the extremes, because governments always become somewhat unpopular. If the 2 major parties are in a grand coalition, yes, you will get a moderate centrist government, but it doesn't mean it will stay in power forever. And people unhappy with that government will go to the extreme parties. And I think this is exactly why the AfD in Germany is very powerful, because when you have the 2 major parties there, they're the major alternative to it. And we've seen this in other countries in Europe. So it's very tempting to do as an anti-extremism factor, but actually I think you end up with helping the extreme parties. And
Yes.
in New Zealand, I don't think, with one potential exception, we have particularly extreme parties.
Yeah. And I believe that was also the experience of Austria for a long time, because they were basically governed by an all-time grand coalition, and that only created the FPÖ as a right-wing populist party. I mean, not to rule it out forever. I mean, sometimes you have constellations where a grand coalition might make sense, but it shouldn't be a permanent solution. Next question then, and this question shows we've got policy connoisseurs on the line. What would you recommend they do with a South Island electorate quota? And before you answer the question, Nick, you probably first have to explain to the rest of us what that is.
Okay, so the South Island electoral quota dates back to the 1960s. It arose from a long period, decades and decades, where the South Island was consistently losing seats to the North Island at a time when the size of Parliament was fixed. I think it was 84, and basically the South Island's representation went from near parity with the North Island in the 1890s to basically being, very much the small brother, losing MPs pretty much after every census. So what they decided to do, I think it was in 1966, they set a fixed number of electorates for the South Island, which was 25, and then they let the North Island electorates grow as their population grew at a faster rate. And Maori electorates were kept at 4 at the same time. So from 84 MPs in 1966, it went up to, I think it was 99 by 1993. So when they moved to MMP, that concern about the South Island continuing to lose population relative to the North was still a factor. So they didn't want the South Island's 16 electorates, when MMP came in, to erode even further. And some of those South Island electorates are enormous. So if you had that, the idea is to keep those electorates manageable, and to retain, a decent sort of South Island representation. Now, the interesting thing was at the last census, I think for the first time since the 19th century, 2023 census, the South Island actually increased population faster than the North Island. So the result of that is actually the North Island has lost an electorate for the coming election, which is pretty much unheard of. So that might make you wonder whether the South Island electoral quota is still necessary. But in my sort of formulations around, for example, the 170 MP Parliament, I've sort of kept the South Island at 19, which is what the quota would be for this election. That could be allowed to fall away in future, especially if the South Island continues to grow at a good, healthy clip.
And an easy solution to the quota, which is complex, is simply to just have a fixed ratio of population to electorate. So if you say for every 40,000 adults you get an electorate, you don't need a South Island quota or North Island quota. That way you guarantee, the electorates have that same population. The other thing you just could do, if we're getting technical, is there's a 5% variance you're allowed for the size of an electorate. You wouldn't want it more than 5% on the first past the post, but with MMP and electorates less thing, you could make a case for a 10% quota variation, which would give you that flexibility for the South Island, so West Coast Tasman doesn't get too large.
I might take the next couple of questions together because they're covering similar ground. After 30 years of MMP, do you think the public understand it more or less? And whatever your answer, how does that affect perception of our electoral system? And the next question is, why are politicians playing rugby when the rules changed to football in 1996? The dog wagging results from rigid coalitions and the inability to work with opposition. So basically both questions are asking, we've been doing this now for 30 years and still we pretend this is still somehow first past the post. We still talk a lot about electorate results on election night, when in fact it doesn't really matter. So has this really sunk in after 30 years that we are actually operating in a different world?
I think I remember there was a report done for the New Zealand Initiative about 5 years ago called Democracy in the Dark, which implied that found that New Zealanders have a pretty weak understanding of MMP and the constitutional and electoral system and policy issues more generally. Obviously, there are plenty of people that are very enthusiastic and knowledgeable, but a large bulk of people that don't really understand it. I think there are quite a few people that think MMP is actually supplementary member, where you have the electorates plus a top-up of proportional seats. It's not, they don't quite understand how MMP works, but that's fair enough because it's actually a very complicated system in many respects. In terms of working with the opposition, I think whenever I hear Chris Bishop speak, he talks a lot about actually there is a lot of work that's done with the opposition, and a lot of Parliament's business is actually undertaken in a bipartisan or a multi-partisan way, and it's really the big high-profile issues where there's the differences that come out and spill out into conflict. So I think there is probably a bit of working together that does actually happen. But I guess I'd be interested in, from a pollster's perspective, from David, as to what his view is on how MMP's views towards it have changed, or knowledge of it.
Well, what's interesting is I think New Zealanders understand MMP instinctively, but not intellectually.
Yeah.
If you do polls of people and ask them, as has been done, how does MMP work, they often get it wrong. If you ask what's the most important vote, etc., there. But have a look at Epsom, have a look at Tamaki, have a look at Auckland Central, where people have worked out, no, I'm party voting for them, I'm giving my electorate vote there. I think New Zealanders have actually worked it out quite nicely. We do, there is still actually a problem with the Electoral Act itself. It's actually a first past the post act with list MPs added on. If we ever got the time and a really reforming Justice Minister with spare capacity, you'd actually rewrite the Act from scratch, because it is still a first past the post Act modified for MMP. But in terms of how the public understand it, I think it's actually pretty good. But it got oversold too. It was never going to bring peace and harmony and all working together. Politicians are politicians, as Nick says. Behind the scenes, we probably have one of the more well-functioning parliaments in the world. We have a bipartisan approach to the rules of parliament, standing orders, etc.
Okay. There's one question I would like to take, and someone's asking, how on earth does the initiative credibly claim that fewer elections without an upper house or other major change increases accountability? And the answer, I think, would be that we are not saying there should be fewer elections and that's it, but we also say that Parliament should go to 170 MPs, which would strengthen select committees and actually lead to more parliamentary scrutiny. So I would actually say on that question that you should really look at all the recommendations as a package. What do you think, Nick?
Absolutely. And another point I'd make is that the more frequently you have, if you have 3-year elections, an important consideration is that in the third year of that election, budgets tend to blow out. So you have a lot of, it's what they call the political budget cycle, where you have big increases in spending often, and as well as deficits increasing. And if you have fewer of those political budget cycles, you might actually get a bit more stability in terms of fiscal policy. So I think there is something to be said for that too.
And I just reject the premise that shorter terms mean more accountability, because if you take that to its extreme, would elections every 3 months make New Zealand more accountable? No. You could also agree elections every 10 years would be unaccountable. So it's a bit like the Laffer curve, which is finding out where that sort of optimal ranges of accountability and effectiveness. And I think 3 years is on the too short. 4 or 5 is common. So I don't think you can just say shorter is more accountable, because again, we just don't sack first-term governments like we should.
Should we pay MPs more to get a better caliber of candidate? Nick?
I don't know about that. I mean, I think MPs are paid reasonably well. There's definitely an issue around their workloads. So hence the suggestion that we have more MPs to help ease the burden. But I'm not sure they're necessarily paid too much, and certainly ministers are paid a reasonable whack. I actually don't necessarily think we need to pay MPs a lot more than they're currently paid. And they also get a lot of perks and expenses and travel and all that sort of stuff, superannuation. So I mean, I don't think they're necessarily badly remunerated. I think their workloads are probably more the issue.
Yeah, look, MPs aren't too badly off. If you include the allowances, the super subsidy, a backbench MP's on $230,000 a year, which isn't too terrible. Cabinet ministers on $375,000. The Prime Minister on $550,000. Personally, I think the case isn't so much that you need to pay ministers and MPs more, but why are there thousands of people in the public service who are getting paid more than cabinet ministers and in some cases the Prime Minister?
Yep. Next one. Does allowing waka-jumping while allowing list MPs to replace electorate MPs assume voters back parties, not individuals? And isn't that contradictory? Nick?
That's an interesting question. I think what we're saying here is I mean, New Zealand, for one thing, is quite unique in having waka-jumping restrictions. So, Germany, where we got MMP from, does not have waka-jumping restrictions. In fact, it's very strong in their constitution, their basic law, that MPs' freedom of conscience and expression is absolutely protected. And I think it is unfortunate that it is stifling. The waka-jumping restrictions are stifling. It means you're not going to get too many mavericks who might want to be a bit of free thinking in there, who are able to actually, to speak out and to push their parties along. I mean, I don't think we would have had a Mike Minogue or a Marilyn Waring would have lasted too long in the 1984 to the 1984 national government. So I really do think that waka-jumping is something that needs to be, it needs to be allowed, so we shouldn't have the restrictions on it.
If you look at what we've got at the moment with Te Pahi Māori, where their former whip has never publicly spoken out or criticised the Pahi, has voted 100% in line with them. She got demoted as whip. All she said was she was surprised. Now it turns out they're suspending her, and I hear are wanting to waka-jump her, and that could lead to 4 out of the 6 MPs being a 2/3 majority, could expel effectively one or both of the other MPs, basically over a dispute over control of Pahi. And that's where waka-jumping laws are bad. Yes, we all can agree that Alamein Kopu, an Alliance MP, defecting to then prop up the national government of the 90s wasn't a good look. But the solution isn't waka-jumping laws, it's selecting better MPs.
Yeah.
Okay. Next question, currently the most popular, is do we need the German system of caucuses getting money for think tanks? That could address some poverty of expertise and scrutiny without more MPs. So I think what the question actually means is not so much think tanks, but actually party foundations. And a bit of an explanation: in Germany, the major parties get tens, if not hundreds of millions of euros per year for their party foundations. And they provide research. They have a network of effectively party embassies around the world. And they also give out scholarships to students. So these are massive operations. I can't imagine we want to have that system here, Nick.
No, I mean, is that taxpayer funded?
Of course. I mean, there's called party foundations, but taxpayer funding is about 99%.
No, I don't think that's a good idea here.
No, me neither.
I mean, the parties do have research units at the moment, which help support the parliamentary party. I think, David, you were part of a research unit back in the day, and no, I don't think that idea would fly in New Zealand at all.
Yeah. I'm against, but I will just tell you, in the UK, they do have these taxpayer-funded groups for each party, and the Conservatives spend a lot of theirs on doing what they call democracy training in other countries. And I started to get into this through the IYDU. So the British taxpayer sent me to stay in 5-star resorts around the world, meeting with local MPs and parties, democracy training them, but having a great time. And we would always toast the UK Chancellor of the Exchequer and thank him for his generosity in supporting my global travels. And I tell you what, if I'd been from Britain, I would have been too embarrassed to have taken the money, because I think it's quite scandalous. But as a Kiwi, if the UK taxpayer wants to fund me to train up like-minded people around the world, all for it. But effectively, that is where money would end up, not necessarily better public policy.
Okay. Final question. What is a wasted vote? You probably have to define it. But someone here says votes for a party that doesn't get representation also signals something, namely the will of the electorate, and it does influence the policies of those who are then in government.
So a wasted vote is probably better. It's quite an emotional term, and I have used it in my report. Probably a better description would be, or a formal description, is excluded votes. So they're the votes of parties that either don't make the party vote threshold, currently 5%, or who do not win an electorate seat. So those are basically what you call wasted votes. And on average, since the MMP came in, they've averaged around 5.6% of the total votes cast. In 2023, there are 159,000 of these wasted votes. Yeah, look, sure. I mean, politics is a competition, and if you can't make the threshold, then you've failed, presumably. But at the same time, I think, as David mentioned, there is a feeling that if you have a lot of wasted votes, it's not necessarily great for the credibility of the institution. You get people, if they're feeling excluded, they're more likely to become, maybe become more extreme or frustrated and disgruntled. And I don't think that's good for a democracy.
David, any thoughts?
Well, yeah, the Electoral Commission always says there's no such thing as a wasted vote. What it comes back down to is, do you want to send a signal, or do you want your vote to actually elect members of parliament? If you vote for a party that makes the threshold, it has a direct impact on where the MPs go. If you vote for a party that doesn't make the threshold, it sends a signal, but writing a letter to a newspaper can send a signal too. So I think calling it wasted isn't entirely incorrect.
Then thank you both for this lively discussion, and thank you to everybody who was watching. We had about 160 people on the line. And just as a reminder, of course, as I said, the report is on our website, MMP After 30 Years, Time for Electoral Reform by Nick Clark, with a foreword from David Farrar. And to both of you, thank you very much. And we hope to see you again next time.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.